All right, guys, we're back with another one. We're finishing out the year strong with this one. We have Lenny with Deerhammer Distilling, and we are going to go over some of their samples. And I just wanted to say something before we even get started. Lenny was nice enough to send me over a care package, and in that care package, on the very top, was a sticker that said, "Craft as fuck." And I'm expecting nothing but the best when you get a sticker like that right on the top. I'm expecting nothing but the best. I thank you, Lenny, so much for coming on and hanging out with me. And let's get it going. Okay. Since we're sitting here, I'd like to get something in the glass. You sent over 4 separate samples. Is there a particular order you wanted to go in? Obviously, you have a smoked one, so that one could be more towards the end because I don't want to skew my palate. But I was thinking start with the bourbon, which normally with most people, you don't start with the bourbon. You start with something else. But we could start with the bourbon or the single malt if you wanted to go that way.
I think the bourbon would be a fine starting point. I often jump around in the order that I like to run in, but the reason why I think the bourbon is a good choice in this instance, whether it be you or anyone else who's not familiar with our product, and I'm going to open my own example of that exact one, in the vein of craft as fuck and Deerhammer kind of being what we are, what we're really known for, and I'm sure we'll get into this more, is really making whiskey that's pretty left to center and, kind of bucks the trends or conventions that align with a lot of styles. And bourbon, I would say, has the most aligned flavor profile that has evolved from, historically, majority coming from Kentucky. This bourbon that you're about to try, I'll talk a little bit about it. Feel free to interrupt when you're ready to sip.
Absolutely.
It's a 4-grain bourbon. This one's a single barrel. It recently went out to the ABV barrel shop out just outside of St. Louis. It is 57% ABV. And where we set this one apart specifically is, and really everything we do starts from conception. So, for whiskey, that's going to be grain. And for this 4-grain bourbon, it's comprised of a pretty unconventional mix of Colorado grown corn, oats, wheat, and dark roast barley or chocolate malt. We mill the day of production. Every batch, I should say, is 1 barrel. We're a very small operation, so about a barrel a day. So this was 1 batch of production that went to 1 barrel and ultimately to the ABV barrel shop.
Awesome. Well, I can tell you I haven't even taken a sip of this, guys, yet, but on the nose, I'm really getting it's bourbon for sure. It's bourbon, but I think it's that chocolate malt and the oats, giving it like a real creamy, almost like dark chocolate note already on the nose, which I'm really intrigued about. And I am fixing to have a sip of it. But why don't you tell us a little bit about the name? Yeah. Obviously, Deerhammer is a peculiar name to have for a distillery. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So when, I guess like a bit of history, I'll give you the short form of how Deerhammer came to be. I was sort of, I was in another career. I was in, design and advertising, working for agencies. And my path was going much closer to beer for a long time. And as I started realizing that my, first life's career was coming to a close, and I saw beer production being the next phase, as that was kind of culminating, I started to really come to an understanding of how close beer and whiskey production were. And kind of fell into it that way. And, skipping a few years of details, ultimately, my wife and I decided to move from where we were living just outside of Denver to where our distillery is now, which is in Bueno Vista, Colorado. It's about 2.5 hours southwest of Denver, about 2 hours directly west of Colorado Springs. And when we opted to move to that town, we wanted to honor the town with or just pay homage to this town that we were kind of newcomers to as we were setting up a distillery there and planned to be there for probably the rest of our lives. And we came across historical records that made mention of one of the very first residents of the town carrying that namesake, Deerhammer. And my wife saw that and she was like, that'd be a good name. And I was like, it might not be too bad. Next day I woke up, I was like, that's it. That's a great name. It's better next time. There's a lot of deer in town. Coincidence or not. So it all just kind of lined up,
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome.
So,
Awesome. Yeah. Because I mean, you want to get a name that's out there that like when people hear it, they're like, I know exactly what that is. Like I know that brand because there's a lot of them, that are very, especially when you get into like scotches and stuff like that.
yes.
It's Glen something, right? It's Glen Britain, Glen whatever. It's Glen something. And so setting yourself apart just in that, and being that you came from a marketing background, obviously you guys do some pretty good marketing, and you're really active on Instagram and stuff like that. So it's really nice to see that it's not just a fun label. It's coming through, and I can tell you already just from the one sip that I've had, it's coming through on the glass as well, which I've been fortunate enough this year, and we're getting to the end of the year, and the listeners at home won't see this till next year, but still, we're getting to the end of the year, and I've been gracious enough to have a bunch of really good guests on, and the whiskey shows on your end as one of the contenders of the year. I will give you that already, just the first sip, which that's pretty high praise because we had some good people on. So kudos to that.
Well, thanks, man. And I guess I'll just throw out a few other things that really, I don't think I like to steer away from best because I think that's a very odd subjective, like I don't think it even exists kind of thing, but different exists or purpose exists. And impactful practices brought to create flavors definitely exist. So I mentioned the grain bill. In terms of process, we've experimented with in every which way, and we have barrels that show that. In this case, this was the majority of our production is a sour mash. So we're pulling just enough backset to, and I'll probably get a little nerdy on the science side.
That's fine. We love nerdy.
The reason for sour mashing for most distilleries, pretty much all distilleries, is it's a easy method to adjust a mash pH to an ideal fermentation profile. Specifically, like with a barley mash, as more distillers are getting to American single malt, too high a pH, trying to go that sweet mash method, oftentimes a high pH with barley will leach like tannin notes. So there's a lot of reasons. There's reasons behind everything in distillation and production along the way. So we do a sour mash. We say a 4-day open ferment, but honestly, oftentimes it's closer to a 7-day open ferment. So really letting the native flora and organic acids settle into that ferment. We are double pot distilling on true pot stills, no plates or columns, which nothing wrong with that. It's just a decision in whiskey production. And I think from the beginning, I wanted to make like a really in your face or in your mouth, I don't know, like just a punch of a whiskey. So we come off that pot still, we make our cuts. For the most part, across the board, we bring the barrel entry proof down to 105, and we go into 53-gallon, 18-month air-cured stave, independent stave barrels that were heavy toast, char number 2. So that's a whole lot of stuff that really points to why our bourbon tastes different, and some of the notes you might be getting.
Yeah, well, and it really goes to show, and this will go back to me patting you on the back, I guess, but it goes back to the craftsmanship, because you could easily get that alligator char number 4 or 3 or whatever, and just get so much filtering and so much of that vanillas and stuff like that. But you went with a higher toast profile and a lower char and a lower entry proof, and then therefore, so you're letting the grain spirit come through, whereas the barrel isn't taking over the influence. Where a lot of, and I don't want to poo-poo the Kentucky guys, but a lot of the Kentucky guys, they want to filter as much of the BS out of their whiskey to get a good product, and where you guys are cutting it to where you guys can taste the actual grain coming across and stuff like that. So that's really interesting to me.
Yeah. And I'm a huge fan of heritage brands across the board for a number of reasons, but at the very least of the products themselves. But you make a good point, and that's something that I kind of always observe and look for ways to differentiate. Is there's a lot of commonality, and that's fine, because a lot of people want a certain flavor profile. Oftentimes I like that. I love that flavor profile, but in any region there's folks bucking the trend. And like last night I just had a healthy pour of New Riff's American single malt, and they're doing things differently. Just because one falls in the region doesn't mean they have to oblige to that region.
No, exactly.
So
exactly. I agree.
Yeah, and
So
we're doing our
so
thing.
I no, it's all right. So one of the other questions I like to ask is, you guys being in Colorado, obviously elevation is a thing. How does that affect day-to-day practice? Obviously, anything from distilling to barreling to do you get a lot of leaks? Does your ferment go funky? Do you have to add things to your ferment to keep it under wraps of where it needs to go? Obviously you're doing sour mash, so that helps with some of it. Tell us a little bit about dealing with the altitude up there.
Yeah, well, the first thing, and it's not necessarily specifically altitude based in terms of impact of the elevation, but being rural and where we're located, when something goes wrong, it's really hard to find somebody to fix it, be it like a pump
Right.
or a boiler or any kind of level of fabrication. That I'm sure others struggle with that too, if you're a good ways away from a city or a decent population. Now, in terms of, our elevation being at 8,000 feet, there's definitely some impacts. I think elevation is there, and the extreme lack of humidity is a big part too. So one factor I grapple with is our barrels. As soon as we get them from the cooperage, we just took an order from Independent Stave a week ago. The first couple barrels we fill will probably hold without leaks. After that, it's a struggle. It's like rehydration with hot water, steaming them, hammering hoops down. So that's a real thing. Even once we do fill those barrels, I'm always on the lookout for barrels that are leaking. So while we have a high angel share, I mean, on average over 4 years, we're close to 10%, which is kind of bonkers. Not all of that is really angel share, though. Some of it is absolute leakage. We refer to as angel share, but it's not evaporating out. It's dripping, and it is what it is. We could certainly do a better job, or no, I shouldn't say better job, but we could humidity control the environment. But I don't know. I kind of get stuck on these things. It might not be the smartest business move from an efficiency standpoint to let our climate do its damn thing. But, we didn't get into craft distilling and, make 1 barrel a day because it was efficient. So, the angle is, well, if we're going to be inefficient, let's embrace those inefficiencies. So there's that. And there's other things I'm curious about that I haven't had too much opportunity to study scientifically and send out samples to labs. For example, like aging in multiple climates or altitudes. And I know some distilleries they have studies underway. I do have my own internal study going with a maturation program in different locations in terms of our rack house, and then a much higher elevation above 11,000 feet. So we'll see what that yields. But for now, it's in process. Yeah. Right. One thing I will say, though, we definitely do boil at a lower temperature than sea level. So, everything volatilizes lower, and that's always, everybody's kind of angling to run their stills cool typically, not run them fast and furious. So that is, in Colorado, we do have the luxury of running our stills about as low as they can go, short of running a vacuum still. Right.
That's really interesting because, like I'm from Texas, where it's hot and humid, and there's a lot of factors going on there, and we have a problem with cooling. We can't get it cool enough, and our distillate comes off too hot because we're having to boil the crap out of it just to get it to come out of the worm at the end. So it's envious in some points, but at the other, it's like you're having to deal with other things like barrels leaking, like sieves and stuff like that. So it's kind of a give and take, I would guess. And does the altitude or that have any effect on the actual product itself? Have you, and you say you're doing, like the finished product, is it lighter? Is it crisper, I guess you could say? I mean, it tastes like it to me, but of course, this is the first drink of the night type thing. And, I don't know. It smells very clean and very crisp, but, we got a couple more to go. But I don't know. I think it does. Personally, if I was to use my personal opinion and use that for what it is, it doesn't mean much. But I think it would have some sort of effect molecularly, with the whiskey. Because it has an effect on your head and your body and stuff like that. So I would think it would that too. But I don't know. I'm not a doctor or a scientist or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I like to think of it as like a whole in terms of, like just like everywhere, we have, different pressure systems that move through, and ours are pretty drastic, not the most drastic in the country, but they're up there.
Right.
And we do have temp swings. A lot of people have temp swings. We do have low humidity. You guys have high humidity. There's all these variable impacts, and collectively, even things like, the strains of lactobacillus that might settle into our long fermentation, being where we are in the Arkansas River Valley at 8,000 feet, are going to be different than those strains at, 2 hours away, even in Denver. And,
Right.
the imparting of those organic acids left to sit after distillation in a barrel for 4 to 6 years, they demonstrate different, attributes, and typically like some fruit notes and, some creaminess sometimes. So there's a lot of factors at play. I like to think that at any distillery, the human factor has the most drive and control, although, while still embracing the environmental factors.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the process, and if you can get into this, because gets into the nerdy side of it. You said you're producing about a barrel a day. So what is your still size? You said it's a pot still. What is your still size? What are you normally fermenting? And do you run every day? Do you run 24 hours a day? How big's the crew? Stuff like that. Tell us about in-house stuff.
Yeah. Well, I'll to start with the size, and I like to actually back all the way out to our grain milling and then follow through the process. Because like I said, so like a batch would be about, let's call it 1,300 pounds of grain. It can vary batch to batch depending on what style of whiskey we're making seasonally. But let's call it 1,300 pounds milled through a roller mill into a grist bin. From there, we auger it into our mash tun or cereal cooker, depending on what mode it's in. So we like to refer to it as a mash tun if we're making American single malt, because it's a different setup where we have a screen on the bottom that separates the fermentable liquid from the grain. Whereas right now we're in bourbon production, so it's more of a cereal cooker. That screen's out. So that 1,300 pounds of grain comes in. We mix it up with water. And ultimately, we're trying to hit a thin oatmeal consistency that will be approximately 600 and 650 gallons of mash that we cool down, move over to our 650-gallon fermenter, sits there for 7 days. Then we move it over to our 650-gallon pot still, which is our first still, the stripping still. And we do our first distillation on that. Okay. Typically, the ABV of the mash, or in the case of single malts, referred to as wash, or distiller's beer, that comes in at about 8% ABV, 8.5%. And on that first distillation, we end up with a yield of about 100 to 125 gallons, depending on what we're making and what our efficiency was that day, if we, did an experiment or not. So those low wines, I don't know if you ever tried them, but low wines, the first distillation on whiskey on a pot still, it always tastes bad. It's just too rough around the edge. No one's gonna sip a dram of that. So that goes into our spirit still. Now, our original spirit still was 150-gallon direct fire spirit still, and that was rad. We used that for 5 or 6 years before one of our insurance inspections. The inspector was like, "What are you doing there?" And we kind of were like, "We're, direct fire. It's cool." Yeah. Right? Sure isn't. You're not doing it anymore, or you don't have insurance. So, we kind of banged our head against the wall and yelled and fought. And then we realized we probably have to concede. And anyway, that's a long way of saying our spirit still now is a 250-gallon squat head copper pot still that we load those low wines into. And the culmination of that one batch typically yields about 50 gallons of distillate that will go into the barrel once we cut it down to 105 proof. Comes off still at about 120 proof. Give or take 124.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That's a long way to say how big are our stills. Yeah, that's a lot of the process.
So you once you do the first the stripping run, you can do like 2 stripping runs to fill the spirit still up, right?
We certainly could. It depends on what we're doing.
Okay.
If we're jammed up, we'll do it that way. But I really do like to run individual runs because I have a propensity to experiment a lot, and because why not? Every experiment can be a different barrel, and if it doesn't conform close enough to what would go into a standard batch of, be it bourbon or rye or single malt, it could be a one-off single barrel that either an account might decide to purchase, or we sell in our tasting room as a distillery only bottling. So yeah, oftentimes we'll do, one batch of grain in all the way through the barrel. And if we're getting backed up, sometimes we'll double batch up into the spirit still. So yeah, you're spot on.
Yeah. It gives you a lot of leniency though, on your part, being, the mastermind behind it. You can be like, hey, let's add a little bit more corn on this one. And I understand TTB regulations, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit, but I understand like labeling and stuff for it can be a pain in the butt. But at the same time, like the experimental side of it is really cool, because like you say, you don't have to meet a status quo if you don't want to. If you're playing around with different varietals of whatever, like the roasted barley or whatever you're saying, if you're playing around with these different varietals, you don't maybe want to make a 50 barrel run out of it. You want to make one, see how it tastes. Okay, this was excellent. Now let's scale it up and do it larger or something like that. It really speaks to me that you guys are willing to play around. So how long have y'all been producing?
Well, we got the wheels rolling in 2010. Maybe like a week ago to the day. In 2011, we received our DSP license, and the next day I started distilling. I was like just sitting there on my hands waiting. So I usually say in 2012 is when we really got going, and that was at that time. That was when I distilled our first American single malt. And, from there we shifted into other styles. I knew from day one, I kind of left that out, but the whole formation of Deerhammer was focused around, this desire I had to leverage my, passion for working with malted barley previously in beer and bringing that to whiskey in a unique manner that wasn't, done in such an experimental way in Scotland necessarily. And it was starting to happen here, but people were a little, gun shy on proclaiming American single malt. So, from day one, I was waving that flag and saying, that's what we want to do. That's what we're going to design the distillery to make. So that is to say, from day one, that's all we could make. I mean, we didn't have the equipment to do a grain in mash to make bourbon and rye. That came maybe 3 years later. So it was 3 years of making American single malt only. Yeah.
Well, that is a great caveat because I wanted to get into this one, and we were going to have a special little conversation about American single malt. And as you guys, and by the time this comes out, this will be old news, I'm sure. But as of Saturday, they just said the TTB just recognized American single malt as an actual category. So tell us a little bit, and I know it's still very new on our front, but tell us a little bit how does that make you feel after however long? I mean, good Lord, what was it? Maybe McCarthy's was one of the first ones to start making American single malt on the West Coast.
Sure they were.
We're talking 20, 25, 30 years. They've been saying they're making this thing, and it was legally not even a category. How does it make you feel as a provider of American single malt to now actually say this is a thing that we make?
It's a funny thing because I think collectively all of us who've been in it for the long haul, and I think you call it right. McCarthy's, I'm pretty certain, was the first, and St. George was early on, and there were at Stranahan's was pretty early in the game. But all of us have been kind of perplexed as to, obviously why it's taken so goddamn long. I feel like it's been almost 8 years. It was at least 7. And it didn't really, we couldn't rationalize why. Like, so many other countries, obviously Scotland, but Japan and Tasmania or where Israel, all these countries are coming out with American single malts. And meanwhile, whiskey's huge in the US, and just everybody's kind of looking the other way or pointing at something else. What was frustrating all along for me, and again, other producers, was that be it distributors or liquor stores, I would wave our flag of like, hey man, you should try this American single malt. I think we got something special here. And they're like, yeah, I've been hearing that for a long time about American single malt, but it's not really a thing, is it? I was like, God damn it, of course it's a thing. Like, so what do we have to wait for the government to tell us what we've been calling it is okay to keep calling it that? So I mean, maybe you're getting it, but it was a lot of years of frustration for sure. And for liquor stores, there was, the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission was pushing hard to establish American single malt sections in liquor stores. And the response, not surprisingly, was like, well, guys, if the government's not behind it, I don't know if we should even get behind it. It doesn't sound like it's a thing. So all that is to say, I mean, I'm pretty damn excited about it. I like again, we've been doing our thing and we make other whiskeys as well, but the majority of our production is American single malt. And while people have been very receptive to it, it's cool to get the extra bump in hype now that I guess technically it's two categories. There's American single malt and straight American single malt. So, if all those things are conform to, and it's at least 2 years matured, then it can be straight, which is kind of cool. So yeah, I love it. And I think that this also opens up the gates to other distilleries that might have been a little hesitant because they're like, yeah, maybe. But now that, this has been ratified, one of the unique rules in there compared to many other whiskeys is that American single malt can be aged in either charred new oak or used oak. It gives a lot of flexibility, and that opens the door to distilleries that might otherwise have a ton of once used oak barrels that previously held bourbon or rye, maybe a wheat whiskey, but typically bourbon or rye. And now rather than just shipping them overseas, they can throw an American single malt in there. And, maybe it's a bourbon barrel aged single malt, or who knows? I just want to see more people jump into it. Yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. So tell us a little bit about this one, because this one is coming in at 56.5%, which is a really nice proof for a single malt. And tell us a little bit about this one. It says 100% malted barley, obviously, but I can't really read the bottom of it.
Yeah, no problem. You got the small form of it.
It's all good.
Yeah, well, to start with, this one also, it's a single barrel pick that went out into Nebraska to a group called the Corn Alliance, which it's pretty cool, actually. It's a group of, I want to say, like, I'm going to probably get this wrong, but maybe like 5 smaller independent liquor stores that in an effort to have greater purchasing power, they kind of band together and they buy single barrels under their Corn Alliance banner. And then each shop will take maybe 5 cases or 10 cases. So it's a neat way to, it's a neat way for any great distillery to sell into a state like that and then have it spread around. So they picked one of my favorite single malt barrels that we've ever put out. And that's not to say it's the best one, but it's definitely up there of one of my favorites. So in terms of production processes, as you mentioned, and as single malt would have to be, it's 100% malted barley. Malted barley in whiskey, in bourbon production, historically leveraged what's known as 6-row barley or malt barley. Yeah. And that is, I guess a way to describe it is a different strain as compared to what we're using and a lot of folks are using now. That's 2-row. Now, the reason you use 6-row is that it brings to the table more of what's called diastatic power or enzymes that will convert starch to sugar. So if you're making a bourbon and you have like 5% barley, you want as much enzymatic power to convert starch to sugar as possible because the other grains don't have it. But if you're doing 100% malt barley, you get to opt for the less, to some extent, less enzymatic power per kernel of barley, but arguably a good amount more flavor, which is, prevalent in 2-row malt barley. So our American single malt is comprised of 80% 2-row malt barley, and then just about for that 20% remainder, an even split of Crystal 45, which is a kilned version of that same 2-row malt barley. Kiln to 45 is the Lovabond rating that is for the color, but it also imparts flavors. So if you think about, like, if you put white bread in a toaster, it tastes different as it gets darker, or coffee beans, they roast different as they get darker. Crystal 45, I find in general imparts a bit more of a honey note that might not otherwise be prevalent in the 2-row. We also use in just about even proportions a darker kilned Crystal 120, which is sort of like kind of a dark raisiny note. And then we round that out with chocolate malt that is kind of a kilned roasted malt that, you know, kind of to the name imparts like a chocolate flavor, but it also gives like some roasty notes and chocolate, coffee, you know, pretty cool flavor. So, you know, there's nothing wrong with doing 100% malt barley, pale base malt.
Right.
And phenomenal whiskeys come out that way. But again, at Deerhammer, that's kind of, we don't like sit on those standards and say, well, just do it our way. We always incorporate other areas to mess around and look for meaningful ways to bring flavor. So that is so
awesome. Go ahead.
This one also sits in, for the most part, all of our American single malt does go into heavy toast char too.
Okay.
We're starting to experiment more with used barrels. We have some 4-year used oak ex-bourbon, but I like new oak quality a lot. So sorry I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, it's all good. I was just going to give the listeners and viewers a little bit of a tasting note so they can be envious of both of us sipping on this. To me, it's like super, when you said honey, it just started wafting over me. You know, the honey comes through, and then there is a dark raisiny note, but it's more, to me, and this might be my palate throwing off or whatever, but it's more of like a fig or something like that, a little something, maybe even a little sweeter. And then I don't get the chocolate as much on the nose, but on the taste, on the back end, it's almost like cocoa powder or something like that on the back end. It's really nice. What was the age on this one?
This one, God, I want to say 4.5 years. It might have been 5 years. With single barrels, we don't typically write them on there, as you're probably aware, and your listeners. Once it hits 4 years, you're no longer required to have the statement of age, although I typically try to, but it's tricky with printing labels. So this one is at least 4.5 years, might be 5 years. It's not more than 5.
Okay.
Yeah.
No. I mean, it's everything's really cohesive together. It's very, I mean, and for the proof that it's at, it's drinking really nowhere near. I would think it would be maybe 105 proof or something like that. You know, not where it's at, which is really nice, and it comes across really nice on the palate. Which I've had my fair share of American single malt, and this one is right up there with them. I would love to do a blind with this one and a couple of other ones that use a similar, not the same. Obviously, everybody's grain profile is a little bit different, but a similar grain profile. Because I mean, I'm getting some of the same notes that I've got on other American single malts. Only this one is, like I said in the beginning, it's a little more vibrant. It's got some fruit notes to it as well, which is really nice. And that's the cool thing about American single malt. And you can go into this a little more if you want. I feel, and it's the same way with Scotch and stuff like that, I feel like the flavor wheel of malt in itself is much broader than bourbon. Bourbon's flavor wheel is very small, unless you're using Aaron grain or blue corn or something off the wall. But it's basic bourbon profile, the barley, rye, and corn. You know, it's pretty slim on the flavors you're going to get, unless it's in a strange barrel or something like that. But I don't know, with malt, you can go from everywhere from light and fruity to dark and dank on the same mash bill, and it's really cool to see. So I applaud you on this one as well.
Yeah, thanks, man. And I guess I would say also, like, I don't know. A lot of times there's a lot of science and research to be done, and if somebody is going to do it, I often don't have to fact check them. I don't feel the need to fact check them. And I heard at a presentation someone was citing, per like analysis, malt barley has more flavor potential than any other cereal grain as it's applied to whiskey production. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I don't live in the lab. I bring more of an art background, but maybe there's something there. I'm not gonna crap on any of the grain. I think they're all really fun to work with, and fortunately, in most other fortunately for American single malt, since it is only one grain, we do get to work with an incredibly flavorful grain. And fortunately for the other styles, for the most part, we don't have to work with one grain. That's why flavor grains exist. So that's really cool. And another, you brought up, a side-by-side, which I love to do. I love to blind myself. It's always a little ridiculous to try to like shuffle the glasses and not look, but I do it all the time.
Yes.
I feel like you're like hiding a
Yes.
peanut under a cup.
Yes.
Something that I would love to be, I don't know, not like an ongoing topic of discussion for everyone per se. I don't know if anyone even cares about it, but one of the really cool things about American single malt is that the production processes, they vary obviously because you can use different stills. You don't have to use a pot still. But the one big factor that there isn't getting a lot of discussion yet is that the traditional way of making a whiskey from malted barley or a single malt would be, and I alluded to this earlier, to do what's called lautering, or straining the liquid through the grain, through a false bottom, and fermenting just that liquid, not the grain in the liquid, and then boiling and ultimately distilling in the still just that liquid, not the grain boiling with the liquid. And, you know, conventional knowledge or wisdom, whatever, would point to would say, if you boil malted barley above 100 or bring it to above 170 degrees, you're going to start to bring out some astringent, you know, tannin compounds. Now, there's also, and again, I spoke to this as well, you know, there's this thought that, well, if you keep the pH low enough at like 5.5 and don't go too much higher, you can probably avoid some of those, you know, harsh notes and tannin notes and some of the grassy qualities. But, or not necessarily by doing that, but if you leave the grain in, you are going to get a different flavor than if you leave the grain out.
Yes.
And most distilleries, like at Deerhammer, I don't know if it was the smartest business decision, but we set up shop to make American single malt first. And now we have this like cobbled together system for making our other whiskeys, which it all works now. We've brought on some great equipment to make it all. But I guess that is to say, you know, other distillers step to make bourbon. So when this, you know, now that American single malt's a style, when they want to start making American single malt, if they do it the exact same way they make bourbon, or not the exact way, because you don't have to bring barley above 150, they're probably going to do grain in, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like what was it? The New Riff American single malt that I just tried, I was having a sip of last night. I'm pretty sure they don't separate the liquid from the solid, but that's an amazing whiskey. It's just so different than what I make. And my buddies at 10th Mountain Distillery in Vail, they make an American single malt, and they leave the grain in. And I have never gotten such an amazing aroma off an American single malt, even my own, that, you know, from a whiskey than theirs. So I don't know. I think it's exciting that so many people are doing it, but that's a rambly way of saying a big differentiator. And I think what people should look for when they're tasting whiskey is, was this grain in or grain out, lautered or boiled with the grain? I think that's a fun thing to do. If you're ever at like a whiskey festival and you're tasting an American single malt, see what you think. Like if you detect some tannin notes, tannins aren't always bad, but it's, you know, it's a flavor profile. Sometimes it can be terrible. You might taste them like, oh, I feel like I'm sucking on like some gnarly piece of wood or something. Tea that sat too long. But
exactly.
You know, the same thing could be said with lautered. That doesn't make it better. It's just you gotta shape it and push it in the direction you want. But it's a neat differentiator for American single malt production that I'd love people to start noticing as they dive in, hopefully.
Absolutely. And I just had Ryan from 10th Mountain on, it's been
nice.
A couple months ago maybe, and he was able to give me a bottle of his single malt. So this weekend I think I'm going to do a side by side of those, yours and his, and see, because I mean, like I said, it's been a minute since I've tried his, and I noticed it was a good single malt, don't get me wrong, but it did taste different than some of the other ones that I've tried. So maybe you're onto something there. And me being the nerd that I am with whiskey, trying to differentiate between those before you go and ask the distillery, hey, do you lauter or do you boil? That to me is really cool. And that's one of the geeky things that luckily I get to do. I'm not just one of those guys, sitting back chugging it. I'm actually trying to learn more about it and do stuff like that. So it's that to me is so cool. It's so cool that there's so many outlets that you can go down in one particular category, and that's just one category. That's not talking about all the other ones that are out there. And so there's so many gamuts of whiskey out there that some people don't even go down. So it's kind of sad, really.
I mean, I don't like missing out. I anything, I started out definitely on the Scotch side, and it it took a little bit of a, growing up of my palate in a sense to realize that bourbon wasn't too sweet. I was just not embracing it. And I think that a lot of people could be turned off by, well, most people do like bourbon. That's a weird example, but most people might be turned off by like an ultra peaty Isla Scotch. But, I always think to myself, there's a lot, if a lot of people like something, there might be a reason, it might be worth like peeling that onion back
looking into.
Deeper. Yeah. So there's very few styles that I won't, embrace. And even if I don't make them, I'm at least appreciate them.
Well, okay. So that leads me to a pretty good question. I like to ask a couple people, what's your guilty pleasure drink that isn't whiskey? Do you have one that you go to that's not a whiskey?
Yeah, I've got probably lots. The guiltiest, I got to be honest, the guiltiest, because I don't like to support, in a sense, this side of the industry is like non-alcoholic beers. Like throughout the day, I kind of, and this is weird, but like throughout the day, like if I'm eating lunch, like I don't always want to, like I have to consume a pretty solid amount of whiskey starting early in the morning. And most people are like, oh, boo-hoo, that sucks.
Yeah.
But it's, it is what it is. Like I have to spit a lot out and I have to be on point and I have to do things throughout the day. So I don't know. It's kind of a weird thing. Cause like, well, I'm always like, hey guys, stop quitting drinking. It's not good for the industry. I do like an NA beer during the day with lunch or something. Another one, cause I kind of like shit on it. The category sometimes is wine. Like I always goof around. Now I'm like, that is the most basic, easiest to make thing. All you do is take grapes and ferment them. There's the least amount of process. That's obviously ignorant and not true, but I do like a glass of wine, even if it comes out of a box.
Okay. Hey, it's okay.
Yeah, I don't think anything else is guilty. Let's see. I mean, I love rum. I like gin.
Okay.
I like all the cocktails.
Cool.
Yeah. I can't really think of anything. All that. I like sour beers.
No, that's fine. Sour beers. Okay.
You know what I would say, I guess, about beer, and again,
go ahead.
Not a guilty pleasure, but like I enjoy that in beer, one gets to see the outcome of the yeast and the fermentation process very clearly. It's not always as easy to discern in whiskey unless you have like some crazy side-by-side opportunities. So like I like to see what yeast do at different temperatures and so that's one too, I suppose. Not guilty, but it's a pleasure.
So that's another, that leads me to another question. Do you play around with different types of yeast and different types of fermentation types and temperatures and stuff like that? And you talked about lactobacillus. Do you make do you sour it at other than your sour mash? But do you do any more anything else to it? And have you played around with that? Which I'm sure the answer is going to be yes, because I feel like that's the type of person you are. But let me know about that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I would say, early on, I would seek out as many. So when I was just talking about yeast in beer, one of the neat things about most often in beer production is that they're not just pitching yeast, be it typically liquid or dry sometimes, but they're not just pitching yeast, fermenting, and then calling it good. They're reusing that yeast and they're pulling it from the cone of the fermenter, or they might be propagating up more. Now, the reason why I bring that up is because early on, my thought was like, okay, I've got all these breweries around me. Let me tap on their shoulder and see what kind of yeast they're running and run over there with a 5-gallon tank and pull a slug of yeast from them to pitch an art. So I probably went through like no less than 20 or probably closer to 30 trials with different yeasts. One that comes to mind, actually, God, this was still long ago, but Elevation Brewery, they're across the valley from us. They make some amazing beers, and they were doing, I think it was a raspberry saison, and they gave us this saison yeast, and it looked like raspberry yogurt. It was like just pink through and through because the raspberries were in there. But why not? It was something worth trying. To be honest, though, the differences are typically pretty subtle. yeast strain. That being said, there are some yeast strains that can be very impactful, like wild yeast that can be cultured, which I'm a big fan of. Like, I love the idea of somebody saying, like, I'm going to propagate up a yeast that I've, basically caught or collected from a specific region, and that will be my yeast. That's cool. Like, I want to say it's like 90, I estimated that like 95% of those yeasts are ultimately a neutral strain of yeast that don't impart a ton of unique character, but they still impart, a flavor. And that's sometimes desirable. And then there's strains that could impact a ton of flavor. Now, we've used a few different strains over the year, and ultimately, there is the need, while there's always the opportunity to experiment, there's also the need to settle on consistency to some extent. Like, I'm totally okay with flavor drift over the generations. We were using a bourbon yeast early on. Then we switched to M1, which is a strain that Fermentus puts out that's historically known for malt whiskey production. And to me, the difference was it lends like a bit of a confectionery note and really punches up the baking spices. It doesn't really punch up the fruit notes on its own, although fruit notes can still make their way in via like a longer open fermentation. And we've recently started experimenting again. I was chatting with one of the guys from Firm Solutions that people might know as, what Pat Heist and his partner, I forgot his name, started, in advance of Wilderness Trail. And I love listening to Pat talk about yeast and fermentation.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely. To the point where I was like, yeah, man, I was like, how am I not gonna, I don't know, man. I feel like I've enjoyed so much of what he said today. I'm like, I need to try one of the yeasts that his company puts out. So I can't remember what yeasts. Oh, they always have weird code names, so I can never remember the yeast strain specifically. If anybody cares, I'm happy to tell them what it is. But it's one of their bourbon strains that typically ferments at a higher temperature. I want to say its comfortable range is 75 to 85 Fahrenheit. I've been messing around with pitching it a little cooler and seeing what a long run does on it. It's one of the things, flavor aside, that's fun with yeast is just smelling, seeing, and hearing how it behaves. When I say hearing, I've never had a yeast be so audible as this yeast I'm using from Firm Solutions. Like, my wife even commented, she was like, I thought there was water running in the distillery, but it's just like the fizzing and like it's like yeah. So I'll never not enjoy that. There's nothing better than walking into the distillery the morning after you pitched yeast and just taking in the aroma and seeing what's happening in the fermenter. So I guess historically we have done a lot of experimentation. We will still do some, but we're going to, I think, ongoing do some blending of bourbon made with M1 yeast and bourbon made with that Firm Solutions yeast. I'm sure we'll have some single barrels of just Firm Solutions yeast. It's always fun to do that. And ongoing when an opportunity presents. We have done some wild pitches, including like Brettanomyces, strains that's kind of a different strain than the standard Saccharomyces. It's usually used in like what's described as like funkier beers or sour beers sometimes. Sometimes like kind of barnyard notes. There's a lot of different strains of Brettanomyces that can even impart like some kind of cool tropical notes. That was a while back. I do have this desire. I still have my old direct fire pot still just outside in the shipping container. And someday, if I could find the time, I would love to set it up behind our barrel rack house and do like an overnight direct fire distillation once a year. And I've always thought that would be really rad to do an American single malt with 100% Brett fermentation, direct fired, and do it that way. I've been talking about that for a few years now. I'd love to motivate, but I'm finding my hands full with other facets of the business. If I was only in production, that would be amazing. But there's more to it than just making whiskey. So.
Absolutely. And that's the thing. And I'm, like I said, I've talked to a number of people who get into this issue that you're in. You're like, yes, I love all of the experimentation and doing all the other things, but then I have to run a freaking distillery. Like I have to make sure that there's payroll. I have to make sure that we're doing all our TTB labeling and all of our things. And you know, like I have a crew now, and now I have to pay my crew. They need to get paid. And, you know, then I got a lawyer meeting and all these things. Whereas I would love to be in the back of the rick house, just pulling samples for people all day long. But guess what? You can't do that. You got to pay the bill some other way. So yeah, I totally get it. Like all these things that are in the back of your head that you're like, yes, I'm going to do that. And then 5 years later, you're like, shit, I did not do that. I totally get it. I totally get it. So I want to get into this rye whiskey because it has a different type of rye in it. And tell us a little bit about this. This one's coming in at 58%. So kudos to you.
Yeah, totally. So this one also was a barrel pick from the ABV Barrel Shop in St. Louis. So every whiskey that we make at Deerhammer always starts with so what's out there? Like what's amazing? You know, what's the whole gamut, and what can we do? Like, what can we I mean, I've said this, but what can we bring to the category, and how can we differentiate, and how can we make this unquestionably a Deerhammer whiskey? And, you know, our rye has gone through a few generations of, you know, recipe variations, but ultimately what landed in what's in your glass right now is a rye comprised of 3 grains, obviously primarily rye, and it's a varietal of rye called Elben rye. I could have gotten other rye varietals out here grown in Colorado. And I should also say we use all Colorado grown grains because always aiming for a bit of a taste of place. And also, like, I don't need to ship grains from across the country unless it's absolutely essential. If we have good quality grain here, I'm using it.
Right.
Especially when it's one valley over. San Luis Valley is like a hour and a half drive from here. Beautiful place. And so this strain of rye, it grows really well in dry sandy soil, which we have in abundance in Colorado. And you know, I just want to use the most common varietal for our area. In addition to the rye, we use oats, which are also in the bourbon, but they're in higher prevalency in the rye. Let me see if I remember this right. I suck at numbers, so I just keep it round. It's about 70% rye, about 20% oats, and the remaining 10% is specialty malt, typically a mix of that crystal malt and maybe like 4% chocolate malt. Also aged in heavy toast char too, also pot distilled. I think rye's a fun one to bring unique qualities to, because again, like, this is a style that it's no secret, you know, rewind 10 years or less, and a huge majority of wines on the market were produced at MGP or LDI back in the day, same thing. And sometimes people would say, I don't like rye. I'm like, well, you might not like that rye. And to be honest, I love that rye. So I don't know why people would have a problem with it. But there's so much room for other flavors in rye. I love it all. I'm in for all of it. But I'm really happy with how our rye is shaped up. This one is 4.5 years old. Again, like, nothing's under 4 years. We'll pull some things older, but this being a single barrel came out 4.5.
Okay, awesome. And to let the listeners at home play along with us, this one, the oats are really coming in for me, especially. Every time that I've had a whiskey, you know, that has some oats in it, it always gives a very creamy, very viscous mouthfeel. And this one has all that. It's clinging to the glass like all get out. And it's not your typical, like he's saying, it's not your typical rye, but it's definitely rye. It has the baking spice, but it's not like normal. It's not like even like a lot of those ones that you get that are like 51% rye, you know, barely legal rye or whatever. It's not even like that, to where it's like so light. It's just really nice and creamy and viscous. And I got to go back in it now. Sorry.
Yeah. You know, and something I should bring up too, that I found fascinating, because I've never actually distilled 100% Elben rye batch, and I've always kind of scratched my head like, God, I feel like I sure as shit should, because then I have a better insight into what that strain of rye bring to the table. Unfortunately, a few months ago, and I've known of Storm King Distillery down in Montrose, Colorado for a while. But a couple months ago, I was set up next to them at a whiskey festival, and their owner came over and he was like, "Hey, you should try our rye. It's 100% Elbin." I was like, "Yeah, this is awesome. I finally get to try it." So I was getting like some really interesting bubblegum notes, and now I'm noticing those come out more in my own rye. Not in the same level, but I love that aroma. You know, I think it's a fun one.
And it is so cool to like try like I think that's the basis of this whole show. Just trying new things and getting outside the normal box. The box is great. It's fun to be in the box, but it's also fun to skirt around the box and play outside the box. And I think that's one of the things that you and I as well love to do. We love to all the MGPs and all the the Johnny Walkers even and all those. They're great. They're great, but you get something, do it a little bit different. It still has the heritage of the whiskey in the glass, but it's doing it a little bit different. And you guys, with your story and with all the things that you bring to the table, that is craft as fuck. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, I made a early New Year's resolution, and I'm kind of glad I stumbled on this, but I decided like from here on out, the big distilleries make great stuff, but I'm such an advocate for craft. I decided from here on out, I will not buy any more whiskey that's not that from a small distillery doing innovative things. And that doesn't mean I won't try other whiskeys, but if I'm buying a bottle off the shelf and I found myself doing it today, I was like, nope, can't do it, won't do it. It's whatever. I like to make rules for myself. Maybe I'll change someday, but I don't think I will. I think for the rest of my life, it's like, independent craft whiskey only. And I just think there's so much fun room there. If I'm at a bar, obviously, I'm going to, often I'm just like, well, what do I got on the shelf? I see Maker's Mark. I'll go for that because there's nothing else. But where I really want to live as a craft distillery, and I think a lot of smaller distilleries do, is if you are on the shelf, the back bar, and someone comes into the bar and says to the bartender, like, what should I try that's different? What haven't I had? That's where I want them to be like, you haven't had Deerhammer. Like, you need to try this stuff. Or the hundreds of other small distilleries doing things that are outside the box. Like, that's a very fun place to live. And I'm looking forward to the broader market embracing that even more. And it's already been great. I mean, I think there's a ton of support for those whiskeys that buck the trends and do our own damn thing.
Yes. Right. Exactly. And so that leads me to a lot of different ways to go down. Like you guys are experimenting in all these different things. What's one of the craziest ingredients that you've used? Be it a weird hybrid barley or Oaxacan green corn or whatever. What's one of the weirdest ingredients, or maybe some oatmeal or whatever? Anyway, you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, arguably our standard grain bills are weird, but
yes.
I'm trying to think. So like, I'm going to go from not the weirdest, but definitely unconventional to the weirdest. Something I started experimenting with, and oftentimes I get tied, like kind of wrapped up in the semantics of like words that we use within whiskey. Like, I was talking about sour mash earlier, and, most folks probably know, but for those that don't, in short, the process would be after the first distillation, you've got what's left in the still, and you take a portion of that out and put it in your mash. Some put it in their fermenter, but I put it in my mash to lower the pH. I think it could be like upwards of like 30%, but we only use like 5 to 8%, pretty small amount.
Okay.
But what if you make a lot of different whiskeys, and you put, let's say, you made a rye and you put the rye mash or the rye sour mash into your bourbon? Well, I think that's okay because those grains could still go into a bourbon. But what if the week before you got a few thousand gallons of wine from a winery and distilled that, and what was left in the still was that concentrated wine, and you put that in as your back set? Well, to me, even though some will say the government doesn't regulate back set, I would say I just disqualified my bourbon from being bourbon, because even though it was only 15 or 20 gallons, I put in, concentrated fermented grape, fermented wine, boiled. So anyway, I couldn't put that out as a standard bourbon. So I sold it in my tasting room, and I thought it was pretty awesome. It had like this like interesting kind of grapey note to it. That was a weird one. Yeah. God, what else have I done? Like some of the barrel finishes. Like I'm big on like I've got a blackberry mead barrel that finish that's working right now. That is, it's so good. I'm about to head out of town for a few weeks. I'm thinking about pulling it out of the barrel because I'm afraid it won't be as good when I get back because it's like at a money spot. But I think those interesting barrel finishes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And kind of weird. The weirdest thing I ever did, and it's not without precedent, and it wasn't whiskey, it was rum. But I worked with an expert in the rum industry, and I had all sorts of questions about Jamaican rum production and these like the mythology behind like muck pits or dunder pits, as they're often called, which is a way to like more or less cultivate bacteria that you will add to your fermentation to develop some outrageous flavor profiles. And she let me know that historically there were times where like, and I could be getting this wrong, this is a few years ago as to what she said, but nonetheless is what I did. She was saying that in Jamaica they would take I believe it's called a jackfruit. They're big, like they're the size of like maybe 4 footballs stuck together, and they're kind of spiny on the outside. And throw that jackfruit into like take a whole vat of what was sour mash, like from that last fermentation or distillation rather. Throw the jackfruit in there and let it sit, and that will bring different yeasts and bacteria that would reside on the outside. It would like, it's almost like inoculating it by just throwing this like giant fruit in there. So I wandered into one of our, Buena Vista is the middle of nowhere. Like we're a town of like 2,800 people. We barely have a grocery store, but we managed a couple. I went into one of our smaller grocery stores, and lo and behold, there are 3 jackfruits sitting there in the produce section. I was like, hell yeah, I'm definitely buying this thing and throwing it, making my own dunder pit. So I did 2 of them, and one we let sit for like, it was like a month, and it was definitely funky. Like there was this, I don't know if you call it a pellicle, which is what forms on top of fermentations to kind of block out. It's hard to explain. It looks like a spider web on top of a fermentation. It did that, and it did some other stuff. But then we pulled the jackfruit out, and we put, I think it was about 50 gallons of that dunder into our fermentation. And I still have that barrel of rum. It's about 3.5 years old now. Pretty delicious. Got some cool flavors.
Oh, wow.
We let another dunder pit. It was more of a dunder drum. It was a 55-gallon drum. We let that one go for over a year. And it got so gross that I had to put it outside, like way outside. And then one of my distillers, we were making rum again, and he decided he was going to use it. So he calls me over. I was at the rack house. He was at the distillery. And he said, hey, man, I want you to smell this dunder before I put into the fermenter. And I was like, yeah, I'm on my way. So I go, and I as I'm getting my head close and like just start to sniff, I got the whiff of like one of the most like horrendous, like disgust. It was just like, if I don't know what was rotting, like rotting flesh that somebody took a dump in and let it sit for a year. And I immediately was like, what the fuck? Like I had to constrain myself from vomiting. And I was like, why did you tell me to smell it? He was like, if I didn't smell it, you would smell it. Like he totally duped me. So I was like, dude, get that
that's good.
Yeah. And then it got even worse. I was like, dude, get it out of here. So we just tipped it over and dumped it into the floor drain, which, in hindsight, I might have done that. But the downside of that is the distillery stunk for a week. Like horrible. So that was probably my outrageous experiment gone wrong. I wouldn't advise anybody go that long on a dunder pit unless they know what they're doing, which I do not. But it's all fun stuff, like I love embracing tradition and putting our own spin on it when it works. So it's that's kind of fun. I think all our stuff is pretty outrageous with experimentation.
Absolutely. And that's what's so cool about what you guys are doing is nothing is normal. Nothing is of the norm. So any bottle that you get from you guys is going to be an experiment in itself. So that to me is really cool. So before I open up this last bottle, which this is the one I wanted to save for last because it is smoked, and the listeners at home are going to know that I love a good smoked whiskey. what are some of the industry trends that are coming up in there? Because I know with American single malt now being a thing, people are going to be trying to do all these crazy things, which you guys have been doing for years. Like peat smoking and wood smoking and sherry finishing and all of these things. What are some of the industry trends that you're seeing on your level, and also where do you see them going in the future?
Yeah, I think like there's room for new trends, and then there's also like cyclical things, or whether they happen over and over again or just get like embraced again. I think everyone has seen the rise in finishing, and I know that gets a little bit of opposition on the bourbon side, but I still think that there's a lot that can happen in finishing, especially if it's not overdone in terms of like, I don't know. I mean, I think sometimes there is room to overdo it. It's okay to have like a complete bomb of a flavor. Like I do a port cask finished American single malt, and it is strong on port, but I like port. And it's a fun way to bring people in who might otherwise be, more wine focused. But where I think trends are going, I mean, it's interesting because there's two sides of where it can go. One is the heritage brands that are this wheel in motion, and they can definitely experiment, but they can't necessarily stop their wheel in motion. So I think that's why we see a lot of toasted barrel finishes, because there's a bourbon that already spent its maturation time in their standard profile oak. And then it's like, well, how do you differentiate this? Hey, you know what's delicious is if a barrel was toasted and imparts all these baking spice notes. I would love to see more distilleries start their complete maturation in toasted oak. And to go one step further, what I do think is a trend that's already being embraced but will be embraced further are char levels lower than char 3. I think char 2 and char 1 are going to make a big impact. I think you alluded to this earlier, but heavy char does some really nice things for flavor profile. But if you want the grain to shine through, and I think if you're using a really well conceived grain bill, one would, those lower chars are going to start to pop up a lot more, and that'll become a thing. I think you'll see that in marketing and labeling is like char 1, char 2, like that'll become a bigger thing than it is now. But then like on the craft side where things can really be embraced, I think, continue. I had somebody come out here to Colorado and joke around like, hey, does Colorado not know that there's other stills other than pot stills? And I was like, no, they do. It's just, I don't know. It's a part of the spirit out here.
It's all good.
But yeah, more pot still distillation. I think going a step further or backwards, what the team at Leopold Brothers has been doing with their 3-chamber still, which God. I mean, to me, first of all, everybody should try to track down at least a sample of that stuff, if not a bottle, and understand like what its historical relevance is, and blind yourself on it. Like find a way to mix it in there, or have somebody do that, because it's outrageous. I mean, it's phenomenal stuff, and other people. It's not just meaningful what they're doing; it's meaningful in terms of the inspiration that they're putting out there to spawn other distilleries to be like, you know what? That was amazing. Let's do that. So what happens when you have now, like, I know of at least 2 other distilleries, one that has a 3-chamber still, another that just commissioned one. That's Neely Family Distillery. Now, and these are all distilleries that we all do the same thing. We look left and right and see what other people are doing. And none of us want to just say like, that's what they're doing. That's what I'm doing then. No, it's what can I do that's different? And I can't wait to see what the innovation and flavors come from those distilleries that took the plunge to, try an old style of making whiskey that vanished and is now brought back thanks to Todd's curiosity and persistence and, brilliance. It's awesome. So that's a cool one. Yeah. What else? I do think an emphasis on fermentation that deviates from traditional whiskey fermentations is going to take more of a hold. I think it's hard to do a long fermentation because you're hogging up room in your fermenter, and you don't technically have to. You could definitely ferment out a mash in 3 days, but I think the 7-day and longer fermentations are really fascinating. the folks at Nobleton's Distillery in Missouri. God, I think Demetrius Kane is doing I think he's doing 7-month fermentations or something bonkers.
Oh, God.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Wow.
Yeah, I hope I'm not misspeaking, but if I understood him right, he was like, I didn't know that other distilleries didn't do that. Or something like that. Like, he's got such a fascinating story and background.
That's awesome.
Yeah, there's so many interesting stories and characters and people doing things differently. And I jump back and forth across the aisle because I love a good tour on a heritage brand on the Kentucky Bourbon Trail and seeing how they've kind of really put the shine on how they've done it for generations. But I love what the new distilleries are doing too. So
absolutely. So speaking of new and different, let's get into this hickory smoked whiskey. Now I was looking at the specs on this, and this is a 100% corn, if the label's not mistaken, hickory smoke. So tell us about this, because on the nose, I have not tried this yet. On the nose, this thing is it's got some bacon in it for sure.
Yeah.
It is so, but it's not like Isla smoke. It's not peaty. It's not briny. It's more like wood smoke. It's a wood smoke, but it's light. Notes. It's almost sweet, like around Texas, which we all make our own barbecue sauce, but there's Sweet Baby Ray's barbecue sauce, which is super sweet. It has a lot of sugar and honey and stuff in it. It's giving me some of those vibes, where it's kind of sweet, but that a little smoky at the same time.
Yeah,
it's so nice.
This one's pretty outrageous. There's very little like this out there, and the inspiration for me on this, like I said earlier, not everyone's into those peaty Isla scotches. I kind of dig them, but I wanted to riff on what I've tasted out of Isla in terms of like Lafroig and Lagavulin and Bruichladdich. I love all those distilleries and what they turn out, but I wanted to say, what would be an American swing on this? And the first thought also was I want to embrace all these styles of American whiskey. We had bourbon moving forward, rye, what we believe to be the next American whiskey and American single malt. And corn whiskey is an American style of whiskey that's often slept on, but it's got its own categorical components, having to be a majority corn by, was it 85%? I think 85% majority minimum. So my thought initially was well, let's go 100%, because that's one thing that not everybody's doing. Let's put the focus on the corn. And there was a book out at the time by one of the guys from Corsair about smoking grains, because those guys they were like the godfathers of craft experimentation. And, I was reading a lot about what they had to say, and I started messing around with it. But the reality was, I want to do 100% corn. And the way I kind of landed on that was to build a cold smoker. And that is to say, basically just like a cabinet that I could load up corn on perforated sheet pans, 150 pounds at a time, load up a smoking chamber that is piped into the bottom, and put a ventilated stack on top that sucks the air and ultimately smoke out, and let that roll for, initially we were doing 6 to 8 hours, and we would just keep reloading the chamber. But now we've got it pretty dialed in where, we can get it to a really slow smoke that'll rather than having to fill it every hour or two, we can get by with every 6 to 8 hours, depending on how we get it running. So we might get it running fast, but by the end of the day, we'll let it simmer down and we'll let it run all night. So, we're getting upwards of 10, 15 hours now of smoking 150 pounds of corn per batch. So, it's a little over 10% of the grain bill. And so 100% corn, we're smoking it before the mash. Then we do that same sour mash, long ferment, double pot distill, and we're aging it typically in our ex-bourbon barrels. The one that you have right now is, again, it's a single barrel, but it's a weird one because it was a partial single barrel that went out to 2 different accounts, and I still have a little bit left, which I'm kind of nursing off of. We might sell the rest at some point, but at this point it's almost 7 years old. It's at least 6 years. And a portion of it went to Sealbox, which listeners might be familiar with. They're online retailer. of sorts. So you can go to sealbox.com and you can get this exact one, albeit a slightly lower proof. This one is, God, this one's a little high.
65.
I don't, yeah, 65% ABV. I believe the Sealbox bottling was at 50% ABV. So proof down a little. And also a good account of ours, the ABV Network. They had some that I believe was 65% ABV, but they've since sold out. So we still have a little bit left. I just want to share some of this one with you. Our standard expression, it's still really good, but this one, I don't know. The age does something like, I got to be honest. The other impetus for this one was, I feel like we got really lucky when Deerhammer started in, like 2011, 2012. In Colorado, anyway, there was an appetite on some level for very young whiskey or even unaged whiskey. Okay. You could sell white whiskey and people were okay with it. And they were stoked that it was being made in Colorado and we were selling it for a while. But we realized that the headwinds on acceptance of that style were stiff. And, I another distiller out here, when asked what the best use for white whiskey was, he was like, you put it in a fucking barrel. That's the best use for it. Like, Rory's probably right. So, so we decided rather than selling unaged American single malt, we should probably just put it in the barrel for a few years. But I wanted something to fill the gap of a quicker to bottle whiskey. So I had in my head that I could make this corn whiskey really tasty in like 8 to 12 months. And I don't think I was wrong. I really like it at 8 to 12 months, but I do like it better at 3 years. So that's our minimum age statement on this Hickory Smoked Corn whiskey. It often gets to 4 years, but on the bottle, it'll say 3 years for our standard release. Right. Yeah. Again, this one's over 6 years. I think it might be 7 now. So some pretty cool stuff going on.
Yeah, no, it really is. Like, it's so unique. It's different. It's not like I said, I've had a couple drams in my day, and this one is very unique because the corn is coming through, but it's not like that dusty corn that you would get even from a bourbon where you're like opening a feed sack and that corn dust is just hitting you in the face. It's more subtle. It's more subdued. And I think that's because of the used oak, it's not giving that profile. And then the smoke or the hickory smoke that's coming through on the nose, it's sweet. It has all those things. It has that smokiness like you were barbecuing or something like that. But then on the taste, it leaves you with a little bit of ashiness on the palate. But then it also has this inherent sweetness and leaves you with like, I don't even know, like cream corn or something like that at the very end. It's so unique and so different than the others, obviously.
Yeah. And there's this like, I mean, it's kind of a weird descriptor because it doesn't mean anything, but it does. I get like up front and then like it pops out a little bit on the back. There is this kind of like slight minerally note that just like jives with the other stuff. It's like, it's kind of
almost tequila-esque.
Yeah. That's it. That's a great call.
Yeah. I get that. I get that for sure. I don't want to keep you all night. We're running a little late. And I'm sorry if I'm keeping you for something. I wanted to ask you, if somebody was looking to get into the distilling industry or the whiskey industry, what advice would you give them? Either run away or become a marketer, become a bookkeeper or whatever.
No, I would say the only thing I would caution anyone at now is that the market, I feel like I think everyone else in the industry is always trying to keep an eye on the market, predict the market, at least like keep up with where things are going. There's always early signs. And the barriers to entry now are higher than they were, as I was just alluding to earlier, then for us anyway. It was acceptable to have a 2-year whiskey a while back, and you could still do that and make some amazing. You can make amazing whiskey in 1 year, but it does get better typically with a bit of time, and every environment's different. Right. I think one can still make great whiskey at 2 years, but the market, they don't. It's a tough sell to say. Well, you tell me how old you think it is, and you can, and people often will guess wrong, and they'll guess older because you can do a lot of things in a short amount of time that really do taste like what other products that are older, but it sure is easier to sell if you can say like on the label, aged 6 years or 8 years, which is amazing. So I think that's a barrier to entry, but not one that should turn people away who are passionate and really want to do the damn thing. The only difference is it just takes more capital to get there, which can be tough. What I think about a lot if I was to do it again would be, and again, like this dynamic could change, but right now, if you go into the liquor store and you have, well, for one, if you only have one product, you're only selling that one product. So this is going to get a little geeky into the industry. But if a distributor is to say like, yes, we'll take you on. So you got one product, we'll take 46 packs of that one product. But if you had 3 products, they would take 46 packs of each of those 3 products. So you have to have more products. But if each of those products is a bourbon, a rye, and I don't know, like a corn whiskey or an American single malt, they all could go in different sections. And that means that when somebody's walking down the aisle, they'll probably only see one of your bottle on there. So something I've been thinking a lot about, if I could do it again, I would have come out with like an outrageous, maybe it's the same bourbon we have now, but a super unconventional bourbon, and then a high rye bourbon that does one thing differently than a standard high rise, but something to be like, high rye bourbon, that's what I'll take. So you have 2 facings, 2 bourbons. I think that's a good way to go. I think I would tell anybody, go pot stills, because that's like, you know, it's a real thing. It lends significant impact to the product.
It does.
Yeah, I would say, you know, I don't know. It's not really my place to tell someone don't make a conventional grain bill, because some people, that's their passion, and there's nothing. I mean, it doesn't. I can't even say it. That's awesome, and most people do, and I'm glad. But you know, there's story, and then there's like your why, and you know, you can have a story, but like, where does your passion lie, and like, why do you really want to do what you're doing? Yeah. I think it's really important to love making whiskey, and like, you know, I kind of wish all I had to do was make whiskey, because that would be the best job ever. That being said, it is also really fun to travel around the country and, you know, meet with accounts, especially like the ones that really get it and are like, yes, we're definitely bringing this in. Like I now I know, like, I want to recommend this to my you know, my customers, or going to the whiskey festivals. Like, I love talking to people there. So that is to say, like, I love my job, but don't get into it because you love whiskey. Get into it because you love everything about the process of making whiskey.
Absolutely.
Because there's plenty of brands out there, but there's not always enough passion for the product. Sometimes the passion is for the business, or just business in general, or money. And you know, you got to do it for money, but passion has to drive it. There's no other way.
Right. And I'm sorry I didn't say this at the very beginning, because that's normally one of the questions I ask people right when they come out the gate is, what is your why? You know, what is the reason that you're doing what you're doing today? What is that why? Because it can be, I want to make money. I want to be the best distillery there is. I want to feed my family, whatever it is. But every why is a little bit different, and it'll show in the product for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. I think it's an interesting question to always re-ask oneself. And you can have your, you know, like boilerplate kind of answer, which is valid. And then you could have your evolving answer and your retrospective, like, or introspective answer. And, you know, with Deerhammer, our boilerplate why of sorts is to redefine the flavor and future of independent American whiskey. But my introspective why does change often. And one is just because I'm a habitual line stepper, and I love to make things, you know, like physical things that, like, making things on a computer screen for marketing purposes is great, but it didn't feel real to me. So making something with my hands again was something that I really felt an attraction to. And, you know, maybe psychologically driven and introspective why is like, I think I have something to prove. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but that's how I roll.
But
where I am.
But we all do. We all have something to prove out there in the market, don't we? Because that and if that drives you, and I mean, if this is what you're trying to prove, Point taken. Point taken. Because I can tell you right off the bat, and this is coming from the heart. This is some good stuff. That smoked one at the end, I'm glad we saved it for the end because I'm about 3 minutes out and I can still taste it. I love it. I will savor these. I'm going to sample a little bit of this out to one of my buddies who's really into smoky stuff. I think he's really going to enjoy it if he doesn't already have it. He's been known to have quite a few bottles himself. But yeah, no, I mean, just the fact that you guys are innovating just in your basic practice and then you take it a step further. And I'm guessing you guys are a family-run company.
Yeah. I didn't really cover that. It's myself and my wife. We're the only owners. We don't have any investors. And awesome. Yeah, we have a handful of employees. It varies year to year in terms of like if we ramp production up or down or how busy the tasting room is. But yeah, family run. I got a 10-year-old that runs around here that scribbles on the barrels when he was younger, and yeah, it's a neat way to raise a kid.
Okay, but before we get out of here, tell us a little bit about your tasting room and where people can find you. I know you guys are pretty active on the socials and stuff like that. Just kind of let everybody know where you guys are at.
Yeah, as you said that, it reminded me of one more bit of advice. I'll jump back and forth to, if somebody was getting going, and that is, do have a tasting room. Make sure you're in a place that allows for the sale of bottles and, to some extent cocktails, and be somewhere where there's foot traffic. And with that, the Deerhammer Distillery and Tasting Room is located in Bueno Vista, Colorado, which if you were, a lot of people don't know where that is. If you were to look at a map and point to the center of Colorado, you're going to be pointing at Bueno Vista. It's 8,000 feet at the headwaters of the Arkansas River. Amazing whitewater kayaking and rafting and mountain biking and jeeping and all that. Highest concentration of mountains over 14,000 feet in the country / possibly world. I don't know. It's amazing mountains out here, hot springs. So we're in a town where we set up our tasting room right on the old Main Street. We get tremendous summer visitation, pretty slow in the winter, although I think it's awesome to visit in the winter. So the hot springs are like 5-10 minutes away, depending on which of the three you go to. We actually closed down our tasting room in October because of an employee housing issue and some other stuff, but we're about to reopen in a couple weeks. I guess a little more than a couple weeks, in early February. We're reopening the tasting room, and I would encourage anybody to come out and visit. It's a fun experience. I think it's interesting. When you look at visiting Kentucky, they've got their bourbon trail and they've got enthusiastic bourbon centric tourism that they are in and they know what they're there for. But in Colorado, people are usually here to go skiing or maybe rafting or hiking and climbing mountains. It's so what we find our place to be is we are the mountain distillery visitor experience after people are out on their adventures and they want to come back and sit around the fire and sip through a flight or neat whiskey or a cocktail, or get some food that pairs well with the drink they're having. We have a really cool little tasting room. It's a small indoor area where you can see the distillery right through. You actually get a little self-guided tour when you go to the bathroom because the bathrooms are all the way in the back, which people seem to dig. And if we're making whiskey, I always like flagging people. I'm like, hey man, you want to try some right off the still? And they're always like, me? So it's fun. We do tours and, we're really trying to refocus part of our visitor experience on, whiskey education and letting people know that Colorado is putting its mark on the world of whiskey. And, we're really proud of what we do, but we always encourage folks to visit other distilleries. Even in the Valley, we've got Woods High Mountain Distillery, just less than 30 minutes away, doing really cool stuff. And, some other great ones not too far away. We've got it's called the Colorado Spirits Trail. I'm trying to get them to change the Colorado Bourbon Trail or Whiskey Trail, but we've got a whole trail of distilleries. We've got over 100 distilleries in Colorado. So,
oh wow,
it's pretty awesome. We've got a great scene out here, and I think people should come visit us and see the tasting room. And if you want to hit me up, I mean, I don't know. I go through phases of being incredibly busy, which I hate saying, to not so busy. And I try not to be so busy in the summer because that's the best time out here. I love kayaking and mountain biking and just enjoying the town we live in. It's a great place to wake up and go to work. My point being, if anyone listening comes out, holler at me, Lenny at Deerhammer.com. If I'm around, like, I'll show you around the distillery, but if I have time, I'll take you through the rack house and we could sip on some barrels. It's always fun to show people, like you don't always get to do side by sides of weird experiments and see what, for example, like 1 year, actually the bourbon you were trying earlier, we did an experiment that year where we flip-flopped the percentage of grains between high oats or high wheat. So the one you tried is the higher wheat variation, whereas the other half of that year was higher oat variation. So it's fun to sip those side by side and see the difference.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Nobody gets to try that stuff otherwise, unless we're doing research. So yeah, holler, come visit.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I appreciate you, Lenny, so much for coming on here and hanging out with me. And I know time is precious, and it takes money and time away from your family and stuff like that to hang out with me. And I appreciate it so much. And you are part of the family now. Like I tell the other listeners, they anything you're posting, I'm going to repost it. You guys are part of the family now. So yeah. And y'all know what to do for all my stuff. Hit me up if you want to join the Patreon. You can get in for as little as $1 a month. Go do it. Stay on real fast. I want to talk to you real fast, but y'all be good. And until next time, keep your spirits up.